Welcome, folks. I can see we're starting to have some people join us for the webinar today. We will be getting started in just a few moments. We want to give everyone a chance to log in. You'll notice that the chat is disabled, but you do have access to the Q&A function so that you can ask questions throughout the presentation. And we are currently recording, and we'll record the presentation throughout. And it will be made available after the presentation concludes. So you can find it. We'll be posting it up on our YouTube channel. And it is, this is set up as an on-demand webinar. So if you registered for the webinar, you will have access to the recording as soon as it's available. All right. It's good. I actually don't see a lot of familiar names in the participants list today. So we got some new faces to our program. I'm excited to talk to you all. We still have a couple minutes before we plan to get started. You are here for Mangrove Considerations. My name is Alyssa Vinson, and I'm the residential horticulture agent at the Manatee County Extension Office. Again, if you're just joining us, I have disabled the chat function, but Q&A is available for you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we will be recording this, and the recording will be available. Let me give folks a few more minutes. We're still 2 minutes from noon, so we'll get started then. I see a hand raised in the participant box. If you have a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A. Otherwise, if you were just saying hello, hello. All right, just about another minute. I'm going to make sure everybody gets a chance to log in. All right, well, my clock says noon, so we're gonna go ahead and get started just to make sure that we have enough time to address any questions that you might have following the presentation. If you're just joining us in the last couple of minutes, the chat function is disabled, but you can ask questions in the Q&A. You should see a little icon with a couple of bubbles that says Q&A, and you can type your questions in there, and that'll kind of hold them till the end, and I can go ahead and answer them at that point. I just want to say welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about mangroves. My name is Alyssa Vinson, and I am the residential horticulture agent at the Manatee County Extension Office here in Manatee County, Florida. We're located in Palmetto, right next to the county fairgrounds, if you're not familiar with where our office is. And if you're kind of new to extension programming, welcome. We are a function of the University of Florida, part of the land grant university system. And our mission is to take the research that's conducted at the University of Florida, as well as at educational institutions throughout the world, and kind of distill it and make it relevant and applicable for folks in our communities. And so, our end goal is really to enhance your quality of life by providing you with research-based information. And so my role at Extension, in part, is to manage our Florida-friendly landscaping program, our Master Gardener volunteer program, as well as do all kinds of educational outreach related to landscapes, landscape ecology, trees, community landscaping, things like that. We have commercial horticulture agents that work specifically with our landscape professionals. We folks who work specifically on marine resources and commercial fisheries. We have folks who work with the family and nutrition program, so focusing more on kind of health and wellness for families in our community. We really span a wide array of topics here at Extension, and we are happy to help and to answer any questions and to work with folks in the community to offer different kinds of programs. So if you didn't know who we were before, please reach out to us and get to know us a little better, because we're here to help you. So with that, I am going to go ahead and get started on our presentation today. And I want to talk about mangroves because here in Manatee County we live, we're a coastal community. And so we received pretty frequently questions here in the office regarding, what can I do with my mangrove shoreline? What are the rules related to them? I know there are rules, but I'm not quite sure what they are. And just generally, what are these things growing in the water? So today we're going to start out just by talking about what a mangrove is. And mangroves, as you can see by this map, are kind of centered along the equatorial line. They like the subtropical climate that's associated with that portion of the world. And so Florida is one of the only places in the United States, and indeed, Florida and Mexico are sort of the only sections of North America that contain mangroves. But they're very common throughout South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, even into Australia. So they're a pretty common sort of set of species that are found throughout the world. And when I say a set of species, it's because mangroves actually don't refer to a particular plant. So we could have, if you're talking about like an oak tree belongs to the family Quercus. So it's going to be, Quercus alba, Quercus virginiana, that's going to refer to an oak tree. Mangroves aren't like that. Mangrove is a term that's used to describe a set of characteristics that plants have. And so you'll see that we talk about sort of these similar characteristics of these species that allow them to live in these very harsh environments. So here in Florida, what that looks like is we have species that are identified as mangroves in state law, and then we have species that are kind of commonly associated with mangroves that can live in similar environments. And so the picture here is one of our very common species of mangrove that we have in Florida, and that's our red mangrove, Rhizophora mangala. And it's really easily identifiable by its prop roots. We'll talk a little bit more about ID in a minute, though. But so they can look like that. They can be in the water, but these are also mangroves. So mangroves can look just kind of like an upland tree, or they can be like the picture on the right, which is a black mangrove, where they're kind of in that in-between space. They're not out in the standing water, but they're not all the way up on kind of dry land as well. Sometimes in areas that are not Florida, you might see something like this on the left-hand side. And I'm not sure if you can see really easily what that is. You can actually go ahead, if somebody wants to type into the Q&A, what are these brown things in this picture on the left-hand side? Go ahead and type it into the Q&A. Somebody raised a hand. Nobody's brave? Okay. So those brown lumps you see in the water are actually camels. And in some portions of the world, they are grazed on mangroves. And so sometimes mangroves can be fodder for herds of camels. Not here in Florida, right? We don't have herds of camels that are grazing on our mangroves in Florida. But something that you may not know is that mangroves are trees, and they are actually tall trees if we let them get that tall. The picture that you see on the right-hand side is of the champion mangrove tree in the United States, and it is located in Lee County, Florida, and it is 64 feet tall. And the trunk has a diameter of 67 inches. This is a massive, massive red mangrove. And again, this is just in Lee County. So here in Florida, we do get mangroves that get exceedingly tall. It's pretty common in other parts of the world for them to get that tall as well. But we're not used to seeing them that way. We're used to seeing them along a seawall, trimmed into a nice little hedge. So when I mentioned that mangroves are not a certain species, right? They're something that shares common characteristics among species. And so that's going to be, some of those characteristics are their distribution throughout the world. So it's about 8% of the world's coastlines are actually mangrove coastlines. They like estuarian environments, which means you're not going to find them in kind of high energy dune systems. Like for us, you wouldn't find them right out on the Gulf of Mexico. You're going to find them in areas where your salt and your fresh systems are mixing and mingling. And you're going to find them in areas where the water energy is a little bit lower. So not really high wave, high energy environments, but kind of, if you think in our part of Florida, we have a lot of keys. So think like Anna Maria Island. You have the Gulf side of Anna Maria Island, and then you have the intercoastal bay side, right? And that's where you're going to find the mangroves, is in those kind of lower energy, the back keys closer to those freshwater inputs. So they do have special adaptations on their bodies that allow them to be salt tolerant. Some of the mangroves exclude salt, so they're going to have the ability to close off the tissues of their, of their roots, of their trunk, and exclude salt from getting into their tissues. And some of them are salt extruders, so they actually have the ability to kind of push the salts out of their bodies. They also are what's called viviparous, which is a really neat adaptation that allows them to be very prolific and successful with germination, with new mangrove trees that are able to grow. And what vivipary means is it allows the seed to begin the germination process while it's still attached to the parent plant. So when you see kind of these red mangrove trees dripping with propagules, those propagules will already have started the germination process, so that once they fall from the parent tree, they have a much higher success rate when they eventually find a spot to root in. So these are some of those common characteristics that mangrove species share worldwide. And here, in particular in Florida, All three of our regulated mangrove species, so those that are identified and codified in state law as mangroves, they are all going to have an opposite leaf arrangement. And so what that means is that if you're looking at the stem of the mangrove, the leaves are going to be directly across from each other, arranged around that stem. And this is important because we have a common mangrove associate, which is the buttonwood, that has an alternate leaf arrangement, which means that when you look at the way the leaves are positioned on the stem, they're going to go at various angles and not directly across from each other. So how do we identify mangroves if they are just plants that share common characteristics? Well, for us, we're going to focus on those mangrove trees that are here in Florida that are specifically recognized by law as mangroves. And so the first one is our red mangrove. And the red mangrove is the one that you're going to see out in the water. It has these reddish brown prop roots that kind of hold it up out of the water. They're commonly called the walking trees because of their horizontal growth habit. They will actually drop down these prop roots, these adventitious roots from branches and spread horizontally through the water. They have these very highly recognizable propagules for their seeds. So they're the pencil-like propagules with a brownish red tip on one end and a green tip on the other. They tend to have a very bright green, very glossy leaf, and they can get very large. They're nice and elliptic, you know, the underside of the leaf is going to have almost like a yellowy green kind of color. These are a very, very vibrant green leaf on the red mangrove. White mangroves are going to be found more commonly in the uplands, not necessarily in standing water. And they are generally not going to have any visible root structure above the soil or substrate. And the reason I say generally is because I have seen white mangroves with pneumatophores or with roots above the soil, but it's usually in areas where the white mangroves are intermixed very heavily with black mangroves, and that soil is being inundated very frequently. Generally, your white mangroves are going to be further away from that area of inundation, and they're not going to have any visible roots. They do have a very distinctive leaf shape, however, which is a very rounded leaf. They're going to feel almost succulent. They're a very kind of a nice fat leaf, nice fat and succulent leaf, and they're most often going to have a little notch in the tip. So they're a very rounded leaf with a little notch in the tip. And that's how you can identify those white mangroves. They will also, if you're looking at the leaf, they will have two little bumps on the petiole, which is the little stem that attaches the leaf to the big stem. They're going to have two little bumps there that are called nectaries, and they do just that. They exude some sugary substances. Their seeds look like little teardrops. So you can see this picture here. It has what the seeds look like. They're the smallest of the three species as far as their seeds are concerned. They kind of grow in these clusters, and you'll see them on the ground. They look like little teardrops. Black mangroves, the ones that I'm showing here in this further right photo, they are going to have visible roots as well that are called pneumatophores, and they look like fingers coming up out of the soil. They're going to have a really dark and furrowed bark on them, and the leaf on the black mangrove is the most beautiful, I consider, of the three, because it has this almost blue-green, silvery kind of sheen to it, and they're a little bit fuzzy, especially on the underside. And so they also will get kind of encrusted with salt as the day goes on. So in the morning, you might see them and they might have, you know, some water on the leaves, but then if you find them kind of in the hot afternoon, a lot of times the black mangrove leaves will be encrusted with salt and sparkling and just beautiful. So again, black mangroves have pneumatophores that come up out of the soil that look like fingers. Red mangroves have visible roots as well, but those are the red prop roots that go down into the water. Those are adventitious roots. And then white mangroves typically have no visible roots. And then the other one that I put here is the buttonwood. It's not considered a mangrove according to the law in Florida. You can see they have these kind of leathery wedge-shaped leaves, and their seeds are these little clusters of button-like structures. And again, they're going to have an alternate leaf arrangement as compared to our three other species, or three mangrove species, which are an opposite leaf arrangement. And again, the chat function has been turned off, but if you have any questions as we go throughout, please don't hesitate to type your questions into the Q&A and I'll get to them as I can. So one of the things that's really interesting about mangroves is that they are kind of the culmination and the basis for the ecosystem in which they live. So they have all of these leaves that they drop and detritus that they catch in their roots. And the breakdown of this detritus in this salty, oxygen-deprived environment is really the basis for the larger food web in which they exist. So you have all of these halophytic bacteria, salt-loving bacteria that are living in the soil, that are breaking down all of this detritus that the mangroves capture. And then as that detritus is broken down, it becomes available to other organisms to consume it, which then become fodder for crustaceans and bivalves, which become fodder for small fish, which become fodder for large fish and birds, et cetera, et cetera. And so they really do kind of act as not just a habitat structure, you know, a place for birds to roost, a place for fish to live among the roots, a place for sponges and bivalves to attach to the roots. They also provide the very basis for the food web that they support. And so this kind of just highlights the ecosystem, and this is going to be common throughout the world where you find mangrove ecosystems. They're going to have this similar kind of structure where you start really with that detritus, and as it breaks down, it feeds this larger chain of organisms. So you may be asking at this point, what does ecology have to do with my landscape, right? Why are you talking to me about ecosystems? I want to know, you know, about the mangroves that are growing on my shoreline. Well, I think it's really important for us to structure our conversations about landscape with an understanding of the species that we're talking about, and also the kind of the land surface in which we occupy. So what has happened, what is happening to our current land surface is going to change the decisions that we make about our landscape. And so I want to take a little bit of time to just point out how our landscape changes affect ecosystems so that you can understand kind of where we're coming from with a lot of the conversations surrounding mangrove protections. So I like to show this photo because we have an image of kind of this broad swath of estuary that's full of mangroves. And then you can see how humans have kind of modified that historical structure of that estuary system with these seawalls, and then, you know, kind of mangroves that are kind of relegated to the corners of our landscapes. So we've done a lot of hardening of structures in our coastal environments, and that's for, you know, for our protection, for our properties protection, but it has changed the ways in which water flows. It's changed the way in which certain species are able to grow and in what areas. You know, if you think about a red mangrove, it needs to have constant flushing. It can't handle, it's tolerant of the 3 species because it stands in open water and is constantly receiving flushing from freshwater systems. So our red mangroves have to have some of that standing water in which to live. If we build a seawall and then we have fill soil behind it, there's nowhere for those red mangroves to kind of go to, right? They can't live there anymore. So they're kind of relegated out to the corners and the edges. And I wanted to show some historical images from our area to just kind of show ways in which the land surface has changed and how our landscape choices can really have an impact. And so unfortunately, I couldn't get back much further than 1973 with a high resolution image. But this, you can see that this is 64, right here is this main thoroughfare right here. This is Anna Maria Island out here. If you're familiar with our parks, this is Robinson Preserve here. And so this is 1973. And one of the things that's really cool about Manatee County is we've actually done a really great job in this county of maintaining our mangrove shorelines. And you'll see this as the land surface changes, we don't lose a lot of our mangrove shoreline, which is really nice. So here's 2006. So again, 1973, you can still see we've got this area right here. We've got some areas up here on Anna Maria. We have areas down here where you can see that vegetation is maintained along the shorelines here. But notice how much the land surface has changed kind of upland from those mangroves, as well as here along 64, these developments that have come in, right? So how might our changing land surface impact our mangrove ecosystems? Well, obviously there's going to be a change in water, right? What's flowing in the water, how much water is flushing through the system. As we increase the impermeable surfaces, there's going to be more kind of water running off and into these systems. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that might be present in that water too. But I wanted to go here to 2015. So you can see from 2006 to 2015, we do have a lot more development. Northwest Bradenton is built out pretty much entirely. We've got new development here along 64, kind of in the middle of this really prolific kind of waterway area here that's surrounded by mangroves. And so very obviously, right, our choices that we make in our home landscapes are going to have an impact on the health of the surrounding ecosystem. And, you know, I like to, whenever I can, talk about the 2070 map, which if you're not familiar with it, Florida 2070 was a study that was put out recently that looks at kind of what is our baseline for development and water use, and how are our land surfaces going to change, and how is our water demand going to change into the future up to 2070. So you can see kind of here in Central Florida, you know, the statewide baseline is over here, and here in Central Florida, we can see that these areas continue to be incredibly developed, and more development is going to occur. Here we are in Manatee County. Here's the Manatee River, right? We can see that this entire area is built out. And so what does that mean for the mangrove islands, for the mangrove shorelines that we have when all of this land surface is built out? Well, you know, when we move in, so do non-native plant species, right? Here's Brazilian pepper and air potato. So we bring with us things that become a challenge to manage in mangrove ecosystems and in other natural habitats. We change the hydrology, right? As more people move into an area, we demand more water that's accessible for us to consume. And in doing so, we change the availability of salt and fresh water, in particular in our highly coastal areas where that salt and freshwater lens interacts in the groundwater. So we're pulling saltier water kind of more inland as we demand more of our available groundwater. We also put a lot of things in our landscapes. This is a really great study that just kind of looked holistically at what people are putting on their landscapes based on kind of sales records. And so you can see that, 1960, we had 200 million pounds of active ingredients of pesticides, fungicides, insecticides, and herbicides being used. And here in 2012, there were, over 650 million pounds of active ingredients. And this isn't to say that, that these chemicals aren't necessary and an important tool, right, for management. We know that we have to have some kind of a tool to manage the invasive species that I just mentioned, and to also, protect valuable crops and ornamental horticulture products. But also a lot of this use has been driven by the home landscape, by the home gardener, by the availability of cheap products that folks can apply in their home landscape. So we have to think about how this amount of product that's being applied in our environments and then, potentially running off into our waterways, how is that impacting our ecosystems as well? Okay, so I've kind of set the stage, and I want to pause for a question, make sure I didn't put you all to sleep. So I'm going to start this poll, and I want to ask you, which of the following is an important service that mangroves provide in Florida? And you can choose more than one. So you should see a poll. If you're on your phone, it might be hard for you to see, but go ahead and we'll take about 45 seconds to a minute to answer these questions. We've got 80% of you have voted. Got just a couple more people that need to click that button if you can. Okay, that's pretty good. We're at a minute. I'm going to end the poll. I'm going to share the results with you all. So I'm happy to see that only one person selected timber source. I wonder if they were being kind of cheeky when they did. But no, mangroves do not act as a timber source here in Florida. I will say, however, that in some parts of the world, mangroves are utilized as a timber source. They have very dense wood that makes for pretty good shelter building for some individuals in parts of the world. The wood also is used to smoke meats in some parts of the world as well, because it's slow burning and very smoky. The main function or service that you selected was shoreline stabilization, and that's great. And then everybody said also fish habitat, water filtration, bird rookery. Fewer said carbon sequestration, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but that's great. Thank you all for answering that question. Okay. So, we've kind of set the stage and talked about historical land use changes in our area and how human development on land and choices we make in the landscape can impact the broader environment. But why are mangroves in particular so important, and why are they protected here in Florida? And so one of the things to understand about mangroves is that they are really considered kind of a keystone species in this estuarine environment because they are critical to ecosystem function. Without mangroves, remember the basis for that whole food web, that detritus collection, the breakdown of detritus, that all just kind of goes away if mangroves are not present. They also provide critical habitat as a fish nursery. So they really are kind of that keystone, that piece that if you pull it out of the estuary, you lose, everything kind of crumbles. You know, John Muir famously said, you can't pull one thing out of the universe without finding it attached to everything else. And mangroves are a really great example of that. They do provide shoreline stabilization. Remember, we have two species that have visible roots, those red mangroves and those black mangroves. They really hold the soil very well. They act as erosion control. There have been studies done that look at the ways storms interact with mangrove shorelines. And we can find that in general, a healthy mangrove shoreline can reduce wind and wave energy by as much as 60% during a storm event. And so when you add kind of that buffer in there, you don't have as much damage to the shoreline. So you're holding that shoreline a little bit better. That wind, that wave energy is reduced by the time it reaches the upland systems. Again, it does provide critical habitat, not just to birds, but also to fish and bivalves. You know, it acts as a rookery for several endangered species of birds, such as the wood stork. And so, you know, that habitat function can't be overlooked. Even in cases where mangroves are trimmed, you have to think about everything that's happening below the water. So even if we have a mangrove hedge, you know, trimmed at a nice 6-foot little square, like they typically are, you still have all that activity below the water line that's happening, especially if you have red mangroves there. All kinds of life is going to be growing on those red mangrove roots. Mangroves do a great job at sequestering CO2. There was a study recently conducted, I think it was called Blue Carbon, and they looked at various ecosystems around the world, and they looked at the capacity of the ocean to kind of sequester CO2. And they found that of all of the marine environments, estuarine mangroves, so mangroves that exist in these estuary systems, have 10 times the capacity to sequester CO2 than a tropical rainforest. So we know that they do a really great job of pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and holding it. And a lot of it is being held in these soils, right? We talked a lot about that detritus and the breakdown of the detritus material and those soils, those you know, oxygen deprived soils that tend to be a little stinky at low tide. You know, those soils are holding a lot of that CO2, and they do it for a really long time. There's some really interesting research looking at mangrove islands in Central and South America where there are mangrove islands that have risen and lowered as sea levels have changed, and they're able to take core sediments of that soil and do some really interesting analyses on, you know, sort of what kind of vegetation was around, what was the water chemistry like, really interesting stuff. So mangroves also provide a lot of water quality benefits. Not only do they catch a bunch of stuff that's washing from downstream, and by stuff I mean like actual litter, trash. I have found part of a sofa. Once I found like the torso of a mannequin, you know, lawn chairs, beach balls, balloons. They catch all that kind of stuff as it's flowing out through the estuary, and they hold it, they trap it. They're like a comb. So those red mangrove roots that reach down and the black mangrove roots that reach up, they really are great filters for that kind of just floating junk. But they also capture some heavy metals, as well as nitrogen and phosphorus. mangroves provide the necessary water clarity for healthy seagrasses and corals. So the sediments that are trapped in mangrove systems in the estuary prior to getting out into the marine environment actually provides the necessary clarity in the water for those seagrasses and for those corals to be healthy. So I think you can see it's more than just kind of habitat for fish. You know, we like to talk a lot about that, and that's really important. In fact, here in Florida, you know, approximately 80% of all of the commercially and recreationally important fish species start their lives or have some portion of their life cycle that involves mangroves. So from an economic perspective, we really care about the health of our mangrove ecosystems because we want healthy fish populations, because we want people to come here and fish. We want to be able to eat fish. You know, but besides that point, they have all of these other ecosystem services that they provide. So because we know all of this, mangroves are a protected species here in Florida. And they're protected through various measures, but kind of the big overarching one that pertains to folks in Florida is the 1996 Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. And this particular act was sort of the culmination of legislation that started around about in 1982. And there was a lot of back and forth between local governments and the state and certain individuals in the state. And eventually they kind of got to this Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. And what it does is it specifies that mangroves are protected from unregulated trimming or removal, but it also codifies a riparian right to view. And what this means is that folks who live along a waterway who have mangroves have the right, according to this law, to trim those mangroves for a view. But that trimming then has to be approved by either a locally delegated government or by the state of Florida's Department of Environmental Protection. There are other types of legal protections that mangroves may have. There are kind of national wetlands rules that talk about no net loss of wetlands, right? You may have heard about this in the news because the definition of what a wetland is or waters of the United States has changed in the last 10 years. But these national wetlands rules will often apply to some of our mangrove ecosystems. And so because of that, there are some other agencies that sometimes get involved in mangrove disputes or the regulation of activities within mangroves. And those organizations are Army Corps, the different water management districts, our state DEP, as well as the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency of the US. So that's kind of the umbrella that talks about, or that shows you kind of who is protecting our mangroves. And the state law goes into a lot of detail about defining kind of where and when mangroves are protected. They have to meet certain criteria. And then there are certain individuals who can trim them. And then there are exemptions to the rule as well. So what you really need to know, either as an individual who has mangroves on their landscape, or as an individual who may speak to people who have mangroves and they have questions about what they can and can't do, you know, one of the first things to understand is that in general, in a lot of our coastal communities, if mangroves could be trimmed, they have been trimmed. That's kind of the first thing to know, is that if you have a property, in general, most of the mangroves that do qualify for any kind of trimming have already been trimmed at some point in the past, and they fall into either this category of exemptions, which is private property, where the mangrove shoreline depth is less than 50 feet, and they are not taller than 10 feet from the substrate and aren't trimmed below 6 feet from the substrate. That's kind of general exemption. Or they are a property that has already received a permit at some point in the past, and they are allowed to continue trimming to the specifications in that permit. So if you're an individual who goes out and does mangrove trimming, it's important for you to know when you can do that and when you can't. You know, as a homeowner, understanding that, let's say you have a shoreline, it's 70 feet long. You have mangroves growing along your shoreline that are 30 feet deep, okay? And they're generally 9 feet tall. You could, as a private property owner, go and trim those mangroves as long as you did not trim them below 6 feet in overall height. Okay, so again, let me say, if you were a private property owner, your shoreline was 70 feet long, 30 feet deep, and your mangroves were 9 feet tall to begin with, you can, as a private property owner, go out there and trim those mangroves, right? That would fit this exemption criteria. If your shoreline is, you know, greater than 150 feet in length, then you can only trim 65% of those mangroves. And there's a lot of nuance here related to kind of whether or not your mangroves are connected to your property, whether or not your mangroves are, you know, measured accurately from the substrate, right? Because the substrate is below the water line. I see, or I saw quite frequently, where you kind of get this pizza slice where people take hedge trimmers out and they trim at the same height all the way along, but they're not thinking about the fact that the bottom under the water is sloping upwards, right? So you might be at 6 feet out there at the end of your dock, but then by the time you get up to the shoreline, those mangroves are only 3 feet tall, and now you're in violation of the state rule. So good measurement is very important. Also, knowing when you require a permit, right? This is a really great image that I took it from the DEP directly. They have this PDF available that kind of goes through the basics of what you need to know as far as getting a permit. And when you look at the diagram here, you can see below 6 feet in overall height, there's no trimming allowed. And this is across the board, right? Unless you get an individual permit for removal or defoliation or alteration, you cannot trim below 6 feet in overall height, okay? Between 6 feet and 10 feet, you, as a private property owner, could trim those mangroves as long as they meet that shoreline criteria, right? It has to meet the definition of a riparian mangrove fringe as according to the state law. So again, that's, you know, less than 150 feet in overall length and less than 50 feet in depth. If your mangroves are taller than 10 feet overall, you're going to require a professional mangrove trimmer to do that work. If those mangroves are taller than 16 feet, then that means that you can only trim 25% of the foliage in any given trimming event. If those mangroves are taller than 24 feet, then you're going to require a permit, no matter what any of the other site conditions are. And so this is a really good kind of basic takeaway for you if you have mangroves. And I would recommend, in most cases, if your mangroves are 16 feet or taller, it's highly unlikely that you will be able to trim them down into a 6-foot hedge. This is where people really get into trouble, because you take a mangrove. Remember, mangroves are trees. They are not shrubs. They can get up to 65 feet tall. So if you take a tree that's over 16 feet in height and you try to cut its main trunks down to 6 feet, you're going to seriously harm that tree. And so what I used to try to convince people to do, and what I still try to convince people to do, is that if you're taller than 16 feet in overall height, you're going to want to figure out a way to do what's called a window trim, which is where you strategically trim branches within your view shed so that you get a window through. You maintain your riparian right to view. You have your ability to see the water like you want to, but you're maintaining an upper canopy and a lower canopy, and really maintaining a lot of that ecosystem function. Okay, and I do see that we have questions in the Q&A, and I'll get to those. Let me see. Okay. I will get to those. Somebody's asking for a link to the actual state law. And I can do that. I'll find that in just a second for y'all towards the end here. So if you have a mangrove shoreline, if you want to do some trimming, who are you going to call, right? Well, it depends on where you live. The state law, the 1996 Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act, allows for local governments to receive what's called delegation. And that means that they can become the authority for permitting and regulation of the state rule. It also allows them to put additional requirements on individuals who are considered professional mangrove trimmers. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. This is an image from Pinellas County. They have local delegation. And you'll notice that I have, I put kind of just our kind of surrounding counties right here are in Tampa Bay, where there are mangrove shorelines. And you'll notice that there are 3 that are blue and 1 that is orange. Pinellas County, Hillsborough County, and Sarasota County all are locally delegated governments, which means that they have gone through a process with the state of Florida DEP to work through setting up a permitting system for mangrove trimming and for professional mangrove trimmer certification. So here are the phone numbers for who you would call. And in Pinellas County, you're going to talk to some folks within their Natural Resources Department. Hillsborough County, that's the EPC, the Environmental Protection Commission of Hillsborough County. Sarasota County, this number takes you to the main Sarasota County call center, but then you're going to ask for environmental permitting when you call. Just say, I need to talk to environmental permitting, and they'll direct you to the correct person there. And then Manatee County is not a locally delegated government, so you're calling the Southwest District Office of the Florida DEP at that number. And that office is located up in Tampa. And so they are kind of charged with managing mangrove rules in these non-delegated areas. So again, Pinellas, Hillsborough, and Sarasota are delegated local governments. Manatee County is not. And if you're looking for kind of, maybe you've called this place and they tell you, oh, well, you have to hire a professional mangrove trimmer and get a permit. Okay, well, what is a professional mangrove trimmer? So the state law sets up some individuals who are kind of automatically considered professional mangrove trimmers. And this is folks that are ISA certified arborists. So you can find certified arborists by going to treesaregood.org, and you can type in, it's a find an arborist, and you type in your zip code and it'll pull up a list of certified arborists within your area. So anybody who is on that certified arborist list is considered a professional mangrove trimmer by the state of Florida. Whether or not they trim mangroves is another question. You would have to call them and find out, because not all arborists are going to trim mangroves. People who are certified as professional wetland scientists, certified environmental professionals, certified ecologists, they also are considered professional mangrove trimmers according to the state rule. But I only know of 3 PWSs in the area who also trim mangroves. You know, look for them, but don't be surprised if folks who are professional wetland scientists or certified environmental professionals, if these folks are not also mangrove trimmers. That's kind of ancillary to their main work. And then there are also landscape architects that receive licensure through this particular part of Chapter 481, which is the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. There's kind of an additional training program that landscape architects can go through to get certified as professional mangrove trimmers. You can find a list of individuals who have asked to be put on that list on the state DEP website. And you can see the link is here, but you can also just type in State of Florida Professional Mangrove Trimmer, and it'll pull the list up for you in a standard search bar. Delegated local governments may require additional training or certification for PMTs. Pinellas County and Sarasota County require an additional certification as well as a registration with county government. And so you can contact Pinellas County and Sarasota County, and they will give you a list of folks who have registered in their system as a professional mangrove trimmer. And so with that, I want to just kind of end with a, remember why you should care. Mangrove trees are not just a great recreational value for the state of Florida. They act as critical habitat. They provide necessary water clarity. They sequester carbon, all of those wonderful things that they do. Please remember as well that mangroves are trees. Don't prune them like shrubs unless you're, unless you absolutely have to. The best option is to window trim them, especially if they're already fairly tall. And take advantage of your mangrove shoreline if you have one. I wrote in here, birds, fish, snakes, oh my, right? We do get calls from folks who say, I'm afraid of my mangroves because there's snakes and rats and stuff. But if you really take the time to kind of go out and look at what's going on out there, you can understand why they're protected, because they really do have just an immeasurable wealth of life within them. Do remember that they are protected. I highly recommend that you call prior to trimming. Call either your locally delegated government or call the state of Florida DEP. If somebody is asking you as a PMT to trim their shoreline and they claim they have a grandfathered configuration, ask to see proof. The state of Florida DEP and locally delegated governments will often write that individual a letter that has the exemption criteria spelled out, okay? Look for a permit as well. If they say they have a permit, ask to see the permit. If you're buying coastal property that has a mangrove shoreline, ask the realtor to find out if there are any historical compliance issues at your property. Look for any historical permits that have been issued. You as an individual can find this information. You have to do some searching on the state of Florida's DEP direct map, but you can type in an address if you select a few of the layers on the map, and it'll pull up compliance history as well as permit history. It can be a little tricky though, so I would really recommend reaching out to those local government agencies and see if they can help you find out about the compliance history and permit history of the property. Okay, so those are kind of the key takeaways. Remember, no less than 6 feet in overall height from the substrate. If it's taller than 10 feet, you need to hire a professional mangrove trimmer. And in general, please do, you can contact me. I didn't say this at the beginning, but some of my background, I did work a lot with Sarasota County through the delegation process and developed their mangrove trimmer and certification program down there. So I have a lot of experience in kind of navigating these issues with individuals. So if you have questions, feel free to email me, and also check with your locally delegated authority if you live within one of those communities. And if you live here in Manatee, reach out to the Southwest District DEP. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Let's see, I've got some questions. I'm going to Charlotte County. Let me look. I'm going to stop my share really quickly here, and that way I can type some stuff into the chat box for you. Let's see here. So, folks wanted a copy the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act, so I'll put that in the chat for you. Let's see here. Okay. So that is the link to the State of Florida Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. You should be able to see that. It's going out to all panelists and attendees. And as far as Charlotte County, I don't believe they are a locally delegated government as of yet, but let me double check really quick. There is a list of locally delegated governments available at the DEP website. Let me find out for you here. Delegated local governments. So no, Charlotte County is not. The only delegated local governments currently in the state of Florida are Miami-Dade County, Broward County, Hillsborough County, Pinellas County, the town of Jupiter Island, the city of Sanibel, and then Sarasota County. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so dismiss that one. Yes, so a question about whether or not this presentation will be available. Yes, it will. Because this is an on-demand presentation, since you have registered, once the program concludes today, you can follow the link that you received when you registered, and it will allow you to access the recording of the presentation. And we will also be posting it on our YouTube channel. I'm not sure what this question means. If you want to email me directly with a question that you have, I'd be happy to answer it kind of offline. And question, so one of the attendees brings up a question about the state DOT and mangrove permitting. And, you know, what I would say is that there are some activities that are necessary to facilitate development. And in those cases, what is going to occur is the entity who is impacting the mangroves is either going to have to replace mangroves in an adjacent or nearby area. So they have to replace in kind what they have taken out, or they are going to pay into what's called a mitigation bank. And the mitigation bank is going to either improve existing mangrove habitat, or it is going to pay for the planting of additional mangroves in a certain area. So that's kind of the mechanism by which the state has set up the ability to facilitate necessary development, is what I would say to that question. And I think that's it. So thank you all for the coming and joining us today. I appreciate your feedback and participation in the Q&A. And with that, I think we will go ahead and conclude right on time. All right, have a great day, everybody.